Hi guys, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we have Alexis Léveillé. Did I say that right? I said it right
Léveillé.
before. Léveillé. Sorry.
That's fine.
And this guy is the No Bullshit Physio on Instagram and aptly named. So thank you so much for coming on, Alexis. Do you want to
Pleasure to be here.
Do you want to discuss a small bit or talk a small bit about what you do? And I suppose, why did you start Instagram?
Well, I'm a physical therapist, first of all, and what I do is I kind of look at posts that people send me and try to kind of dispel some misinformation that's going on in the fitness and physio space. Usually I use a lot of like humor, and it could be I can go hard at people, but in general I'll try to make fun of the ideas, and I go about like after people that are relentless about, not respecting the science is the way I see it. Like I was going nowhere and threading water. I think it was started like on the MoveU boards, and I was trying to change people's minds because I felt like a lot of people were getting information that was outdated, and a lot of like nocebo and like fear of movement was being spread, which I find really unhelpful. Like modifying the way you move short term can be very helpful, but always moving like you're gonna break is counterproductive long term, and I think that's a problem. And I feel like MoveU's platform, which is like a big fitness and physio space, I think they have like almost like 2 million people now. Well, I think they market it like they make people afraid to move, and they're like, we provide a solution, which I think a lot of like big pages do. So I started like going nowhere and just basically driving the algorithm to them with my comments. So I started a physio space, and I was like, I'm just gonna like provide what I think is the right science and make humor out of it. So kind of sublimate my frustrations. And yeah, that's where it got me now.
Very nice. Okay. So I suppose like what you said there about MoveU, it's a page years ago when I started, like obviously they built up so fast. And it's a page that like you can see it, they're neglecting to change because they found something that fits the algorithm and something that works. Yeah. And it's a difficult one because I was talking to you before the podcast, the amount of people that come to me and quote these pages with 1 million followers, 2 million followers with outdated information. And they're still, once you get into that side of things, like very, very, very hard to break that belief. Like, I think it's so hard, like to not just go calling out a few of them now, but I also will at the same time, like Squat University, another one, based in the mechanical side of things, not really introducing the biopsychosocial model as much as I would like. And for a page with an audience like that, it's crazy to see what they're doing. Is there any other ones that stick out for you? Any other pages that really stick out for spreading or not changing in their ways?
I mean, I guess functional patterns. Go to a little bit. I like the go to guys. There's one of the only pages where I think I can have a real conversation with them. We come from completely different lens, but they're willing. Like at one point I was trying to get an RCT going about their approach, because we haven't done it specifically. We only modify movement, don't do much else for ACL testing. I don't think it's going to work. It's my bias, but I'm very willing to confront it. And then we actually had a talk for 30 minutes with one of the founders. So I really respect them for that. I disagree with the way they do things. Like, I don't think it works, but I think they might help people for different reasons. But yeah, I'd say they're still anchored in that biomechanical model. Who else? Yeah, Squat U, Andrew Locke, big pages like this. I think whatever. I don't want to call out specific names. Human Garage is probably the worst stew of misinformation, but it's very interesting. It's almost like they're taking the biopsychosocial model the other way. Okay. Where like it's like everything is connected, everything is your organs and your fascia. Your ankle pain is caused by your liver, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the things you said about like not evolving for MoveU, because I think it's like I don't know if you've heard that thing where people stop growing when they become the most famous.
Yeah.
And that's why like child actors struggle. That's why Adam Sandler is still dressing the same he did in the 90s, and Michael Jordan as well. It's just like, why would you evolve past that? It's like that old trope of the guy who peaked in high school. Well, they peaked they did extremely well financially and in terms of like reputation by using that like fear-based approach, and like you need to move this way, and like scapular dyskinesia is bad, you can't bring your knees in, you have to stay aligned. It worked for them because people respond really well to fear, and we have like a lot of studies on that in the media, right? That there's the saying like if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, that's why like crime, what is it called, like true crime is so popular, especially with people who are vulnerable. And I don't want to call like women vulnerable as a whole, but the target of serial killers is, it's women, and they're the ones that are watching true crime the most. So I think there's like a survival aspect of that. So people in pain are going to be driven to pages that spread fear of movement because they're tired of having pain. So it's like human nature at work, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. That it's actually suited to those people. I suppose it is. There's another quote. I'm sure you heard it. It's someone or a person with a patient without a diagnosis is naked to the public. So being able to tell somebody, I don't know, have you ever come across that before? But it's like if you go into the physio or if you go into the doctor and you've been sick for a while or if you've been in pain, it's a lot easier like for you to come out and actually have a diagnosis. Oh, I have a bulging disc. Okay. As opposed to, oh, I've been sleeping poorly. My stress is up to the roof. There's a lot of stuff going on at work that I'm not dealing with properly at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to give someone a diagnosis, to just say to the public, to say to somebody who asks them, say to their partner, oh, it's actually, no, it's caused by a bulging disc.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in psychology, which by nature is anchored in the biopsychosocial model, there's a big reluctance in giving someone a diagnosis because it's like a double-edged sword. Yeah, it can make the patient feel better, like having like, oh, like now with a plan, I know what the enemy is, but it can also be very like disabling to have a diagnosis. So like if you're told like, oh, you have a what is it called, like a BPD, like a borderline personality disorder, you got the stigma that's going with it. The person's got to identify with it and going to be like, oh yeah, I'm like this because of this, and it can be really, really bad, especially if it's a misdiagnosis. And often, like for example, like if you have like a hernia, a lot of times people will have low back pain like 10 years later, and their hernia has been done. Like 66% of the time, the hernia has been gone after a year. And then you're like, well, you don't have a hernia anymore in the disc, and they think they're crazy because they have pain.
Yeah, I know I've often come across it. The other one, and as you mentioned there, with looking at the ankle, the flat feet. I'm sure you've come across that with people. How people who have flat feet now have neck pain because everything up along the chain has been affected. And
that's crazy.
It's a difficult one because you're trying to break a belief that's been like ingrained over years and years and years. How do you go about doing that? Like, how do you approach that with a patient or with a person who comes to you and has this mechanical model or biomechanical model in their head, and they're just throwing it and they're saying, okay, I don't care what else it is. I'm not going to listen to anything you talk about when it comes to like relationship stuff or sleep or lifestyle. I know it's because I've overpronation in my feet.
It's really hard. I mean, that's why often I prefer when a patient has never seen someone.
Yeah,
I think that's better because creating new beliefs is much easier than it is to break old ones. But when I do, if I ever try to address it, I try to validate the person's beliefs first, because there is a reason why they believe this. And it might have been true at the beginning, right? For example, if you have knee pain, modifying how you walk short term is going to help with the pain, but it doesn't mean the way you were walking was what caused the pain initially.
Yeah.
Or the reason why you still have pain. So, there's like a kernel of truth that you have to validate and acknowledge. And then after that, you can explain why. And usually you can explain it through the science. It's like, well, we used to think of this because the studies showing if you change this, you get better. But after that, you explain why the science changed. Like, but if we look at people before they have pain, this doesn't seem to make a difference. So it might have not been the cause. So maybe we can reintroduce that way of walking. So you kind of give them like, it's true, but you don't never go like, no, you're wrong. Because I think that's the best way. I've done that in the past. And like, I sometimes do it by accident. And it's like, people hate that. Like it breaks up the relationship immediately, because it's almost like you've been telling them they've been gaslit by someone they probably liked a lot. Like their physio probably meant well when they said that. And the other way you can do it is acknowledge it, but mention the other variables, right? What's good with the biopsychosocial model is there's a study by Léveillé in 2020, which actually discusses biomechanics. And if you look, it's like a spider web graph of all the variables that can influence pain. for the low back, and there's about like 120 variables that have been like identified by different studies. So it's like, yes, you may be a flat feet, but there's like these other hundreds of reasons why you might have pain. So since you've worked on this before, maybe we can address these other things, like sleep, emotions, how much you're doing, like load management, your work schedule, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point of saying that you cannot say to someone that you're wrong, especially in a belief, because first off, straight away their defense mechanism is going to go up.
Yeah,
and they have to defend that ego in a way as well. That's an interesting study though, because like I haven't read that one specifically, but in terms of what you're talking about, I think addressing the biomechanical and saying, okay, your flat feet or your feet, maybe if you, for probably an easier way to describe it, I often say to people, acutely, biomechanics can change pain.
That's good. Yeah.
So like, okay, you sprain your ankle, then your perennials might start kicking up a small bit more. You might get a knee issue, or maybe knee issue if you have to go back to work and you're walking a lot and all that. But in general, the body's extremely good at adapting. Yep. So at a certain stage, the mechanical or the biomechanical side of it has to be healed up. So you have all this leftover pain. What's causing that? Was it a traumatic injury? Was it a car crash? If you look at all these other things as well. Will you dive into the biomechanical side of things, or not the biomechanical, the biopsychosocial side of things? What is your understanding of it? How do you use it with patients?
I try to ask questions right away when I do my interview. Like sometimes people look at me weird, but I always like ask like, what's your level of pain where you do this or that? Like obviously, but then I always ask them like, how's your sleep and like how many hours you sleep. I try to make it like objective so that it's not that weird. Like asking, hey, how's your sleep? Very general. They're all going to tell like fine. But if you ask like how many hours do you feel refreshed, and then I'm asking them like if they snore to make sure they don't have like sleep apnea and stuff like that. But then after that, I ask them their level of stress on 5, like in the last few, like depending on how they're presenting, like if they look really stressed right now, or if they look like they were having a shit month, I ask for a specific period of time, and then I ask them to put a number on it. And I think just that, it kind of opens up a conversation that you're going to have like a whole picture. Yeah. And I think it also helps that I work in a multi-clinic with a lot of like osteos who are kind of like, I'd say, early adopters of the biopsychosocial model. I think they apply it's all connected to a fault, where like emotions will cause like your liver to dysfunction, which cause like your ankle or knee to hurt and stuff like that. I don't subscribe necessarily to this specific way of thinking, but I do think it's really helpful. And I think that's one of the ways where osteopathy is kind of helpful, is they look at the person as a whole. So I try to do that. Like, I think the context helps because they know, and I do like one-on-one all the time. I'm not in an office with everyone around. It's like very personal. So I think that helps. And then, when we're doing exercise and stuff, I can mention other reasons, again, bringing up the biopsychosocial model, stuff that can hurt. So I love citing studies that kind of quantify how much psychological aspects can have an effect. So I think it was Soria Oliver in 2017, I think, who did a meta-analysis, mediation analysis. So they looked at people with neck pain, and then they checked their levels of stress and like what we call like the mental workloads, like how many hours they had and the level of stress and all that. And they saw that was a predictor of about 17.5% of the neck pain. And by predictor, I mean like you can explain 17.5% of the neck pain office workers had.
Okay. And
yeah, so it's like not the whole thing, but it is a big thing.
Yeah, that's I suppose for those who are listening who don't know what the biopsychosocial is, how would you explain it?
It's that there's more things than just mechanics that predict pain. So there's your level of stress, your like your what do you call it, your sleep, load management, like how much you're doing. I think those are the big three, and also your environment. So there's like a debate as to whether the biopsychosocial model integrates the environment as a whole, because that's more like the ecological model, where it's like you're kind of a piece of a cog that's society, which influences your willpower. It's not like you do your decisions in a vacuum. But I try to kind of mix the two together and recognize that there's a lot of things that people don't control, and ask about like the pressures at work. Because I think that's a good thing, because I think a lot of people come see us when it's like at a breaking point where like everything's going wrong. And sometimes just like asking about it and them having a good cry in the office is like very therapeutic.
Yeah. And the other side of things is that a lot of people that are coming in, just in a lot of cases, obviously they have an injury or they have pain, but they're just looking for somebody to listen to them as well, to hear them out, to make sure that it's not just there, like in their head, basically. And I find that can be a difficult thing when you are trying to discuss the biopsychosocial, when you're trying to bring it up that, okay, there is other factors here, like there is stress that can amplify pain. You know, if your sleep is out of whack, if you're fighting, if there's conflict at work and that's out of whack, that can amplify pain as well. But then some people can connect to it and say, so are you saying this is all in my head?
Yeah.
So how do you work around that side of things?
So I've had people say that in the past. So the way I preemptively always ask, like, especially if they like raise their eyebrows when I'm talking about the level of stress, is I say, you know, stress is probably not what caused the pain, but it's definitely like it can definitely make it worse.
Yeah.
So kind of like and I think there's some support in the literature for that it's more like a modulating variable than a mediating variable. So the difference is mediating is like turning the switch on and off, and modulating is like the dimmer.
Yeah.
So that's the way I see it. It's like these other factors can make it worse. And for sleep, it's easy because like people intuitively can like respond to that. It's like, well, maybe you're not recuperating well enough from the demands that you're asking your joint or your tendon. And sleep is like is the best way to recuperate. So we need to get that better, for instance, or we should.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's something that I have to say for me. And it's funny that you reach out to me. It's funny that when you tag me in a post at one stage with mobility coaches, and about people who are hypermobile and still couldn't explain their pain, taking the piss, obviously. I thought it was hilarious. With me, when I started out, I was, as you can see, even with the name in the bio, I was tied to the mobility side of things, to the movement side of things specifically. And it was actually one of my only outlets in terms of like, okay, well, it always has to be that way. I think when I went and I had done my master's and then I went through the physio course and they introduced that biopsychosocial model, and then you start to talk to people who have injuries ongoing for 3, 6, 12 months, it really made me change my approach and change how I dealt with people. Because you can be doing all the, how would you say, like you can give all the examples in the world of, okay, right, your back pain is because you're sitting down at work too much, or because your posture and all that. But that doesn't translate over. It really doesn't translate into real life, into like the way that people are on a day-to-day, and especially with the amount of people that are working in an office. Because I'll often say to people, right, you have pain, but why doesn't the person beside you have the same pain when you're sitting in the same position for the whole day?
Yeah.
So when you came out of college, or when you went into college, did you have different preconceived notions of the biomechanical versus the biopsychosocial? When did you actually get introduced to the biopsychosocial model?
Like my last course mostly, and like we had this guy named Timothy Weidman, which is pretty well like known in the pain science world. Gave us like one course from pain science. That was like my first time hearing it, and then also had like a really good tutor, like a very skeptical guy who gave me a course in outpatient private when we have like in placement. I don't know if you guys have that. I guess, right? Like clinical rotations.
Oh yeah.
So he introduced me to like Adam Meekins and all that stuff. So I was like a bit aware of it, but like you, I think it was seeing patients and like stuff not working that were really knowledge out, like how big of a stamp it has. I think it predicts most of the pain. Like biomechanics, I think is like, it's not that it's the small variable, it's just that it's one of so many.
Yeah.
And arguably for a lot of things, like I think it's probably the main, like it's very clearly the most important. Like if you have an acute tear, of course the biomechanical model is the best predictor. It's just there's a lot of things, especially for chronic pain, where other variables become more and more important, like neural sensitization, like fear, stuff like that. I'd say if we want to make it a very, very small claim, like a very reductionist take, like rule of thumb, the earlier it's been, the more likely it is to be biomechanical, especially for sports injuries, probably not for like back pain. Then the farther you go in time, the more likely it is to be other factors, especially fear, like kinesiophobia. And I think there's a lot of like studies on cognitive functional therapy and stuff like that, where we see that the change that we do is probably mostly explained by the change in fear related to movement. So there's like the Mansell study from 2017, which is a big one, and there's others. And there's 4 on this, and they all come to pretty much the same conclusion, which can be like defeating for a lot of physios. But it's like what we're doing is working, is just not for the same reasons.
Yeah. When you look at the physio profession or the physical therapist profession, what I heard you mentioned back pain there, and obviously there's the acute side of things, but what other injuries or issues or diagnosis do you feel are maybe overdiagnosed and not getting to the root cause, or not given a better? Because like what I often see is that bulging disc. That has to be the number one for me, is the bulging disc causing pain. Now it does cause pain in a lot of situations when it's severely bulged and it's touching off a nerve. But then there's so many other ones as well, like even rotator cuff tears or meniscus injuries, stuff like that. What ones do you see stick out the most to you? And yeah, well, I suppose with that first, what are ones that stick out most?
Yeah. I'd say I don't have that big of an issue with those because these are things that will stay on imaging often, like bulging discs. Usually they stay there. It's more like when the disc is extruded that it gets like it goes away on its own.
Yeah.
And rotator cuff, same. They rarely, like, they don't regrow generally, except if it's like maybe acute and it's quite rare. So those I don't have like that big of an issue. Like, yeah, if people tells you it's about that, it's probably like way more stuff that goes into it, but it can be like, it can be a trigger. And a lot of people, they only cite, when they cite the Debunking like 2015 meta-analysis, they always cite like, oh, look at all these people that have these things and they don't have pain, they have disc bulges and stuff. They forget that he did another meta-analysis the same year, which shows that like it's 3 times more likely, or I think it's like 5 times more likely to have pain if you have a disc bulge.
Yeah.
So there's that side of it. It's like there's a high chance that it's not what's causing your pain, but you have a bigger chance of having pain if you have them. It's like a risk factor. I tell it to patients, it's like, it's not because you have hypertension that you're going to get a heart attack, but it's just a risk factor. So it might be more recurrent. So my big issue, I think, is really like low hanging fruit, like diagnoses that don't exist or that we can't diagnose. So like SI joint pain, not SI joint pain, but like an upslip of the pelvis and stuff like that. Like, oh, your SI is out.
Yeah.
Because like that's physically, except like extremely rare cases where like there's been like a car accident or something, or there's like metabolic disorders that will dissolve the ligament. Extremely rare. Like it doesn't, and we probably can't diagnose this with our hands. Like there's this paper from Celis from 2010, which like looked at the precision of our hands. And if you compare the Priest paper, like so that paper is a systematic review that looked like how much the SI moved. It moves so little that it's smaller than the difference between like your touch receptors. So it's really? Like the way I explain it, it's like trying to measure centimeters with the ruler that has decimeter increments. It's like, how are you going to be specific? You can't, like, your hands are not precise enough. And that's assuming you're touching it at the base. Whereas we're going through these super thick tissue and like a living person that has muscles that contract. So it's like, even at a conceptual level, it's not, I think, possible to diagnose it. You can say that someone has SI joint pain. That's a real diagnosis, but saying like it's because it's not moving well or that it's out of place is like, honestly, it's like flatter level of science, in my opinion. The other would be like your patella isn't moving well. I don't think there's a lot of support for that either. What's the big one? I think those are my 2 big ones. Like I hate when I hear that, because it's like my immediate reaction is to the other therapists is like, well, read a paper, please.
Yeah,
like, we've had papers on this since 1998. Like, Jesus Christ, like, I don't know.
The hips off whack is a big one for me. Oh, I had one hip that was higher than the other. That's a big one. Like as a diagnosis, that was, and then it was cracked back into place, and now I'm good again. Like that is, as you said there, like only if a car accident would drive it off in a lot of cases. But yeah, I think when it comes to that and it comes to those adjustments, and I definitely not to pick out the chiropractic profession, because there's some absolute excellent chiropractors out there, but that idea of adjustments, and I still see physios do it a lot as well, is an outdated treatment technique in ways. How do you, what's your perspective on it? I know you're fairly you have strong opinions on it.
On like adjustments in general?
An adjustment as a primary treatment.
As a primary treatment, I'm pretty much against it. It's just because I don't know, if you look at the effects on pain, at least for like stuff like acute pain, it's like less than 1 out of 10. It's like 9.95 on a 100 scale of pain, which is small in what we consider a minimally clinical important difference. there's a systematic review on this if people want to know. It's like pinned on my profile. But yeah, and there's like a 40% chance that people are going to have worse pain as a side effect. So the way I explain it to patient, it's like, it's literally like throwing a coin in the air, and like the dial can go either way. A little bit worse, a little bit better. I think the serious harm are extremely overblown. Like they're extremely rare, and they're less frequent than like what we call it, like an NSAID. Like if you give someone naproxen, the risk of stroke is like much higher, but no one talks about that compared to like a spinal adjustment.
Say again.
So the risk of stroke from like a naproxen is much higher than it is from getting an adjustment.
Okay.
But like no one talks about it because there's clearly a bias against chiropractors. So I think that's kind of unfair to them. And to be fair, we don't have good data because they don't report adverse events well enough. But the studies that do show like what I'm saying. So yeah, I think like I don't mind if someone likes it. I'm like, okay, go get it. If it helps you short term, I don't mind. It's just more about the narrative. And I don't think, like, again, there's some like great chiros, a lot of them. It's just if the way they're explaining it, if they're explaining it in the way that promotes fragility, I think it's like you're maybe getting the patient better short term because you're telling them, oh, you were out of place and I put you back. Gives them like, it helps with fear of pain and makes them feel better. And there's this whole like therapeutic relationship. It's just the problem is like long term, they're going to think they need you, which creates dependence, and it creates fear of movement because you think your back is this fragile thing that you can like pop out of place. It's like if a little crack with the hands can put like a spine back in place, running, which creates like 3 to 7 times the weight of your body in your joint, it would like make your spine crumble every step. So like, psychologically, I think it's really, really harmful. So you're helping short term by creating long-term harm. And you can do those adjustments. And I do manual therapy. It's just when I do it, I don't use those narratives. I'm just like, hey, this like human touch feels good. We're kind of moving the joint in a way that it maybe can't right now. So it feels good. We're providing movement and touch, and that's stuff that helps.
Yeah.
I explained it something really simple and basic like that. And there's papers that have been done on this. I think Lorimer Mosley did like, he compared like a mobilization to the spine in 2010, I think, with like an explanation that was biomechanical compared to a mobilization that was done with what we call like a pain science explanation, where kind of like the way I explained it, right? And where it like helps desensitize the joint by having a neurophysiological effect. And it was better. So it was better doing it than with a biomechanical explanation. Patients liked it better too. They were more satisfied. So it might sound weird, but like if you're not sure, look at that paper and look at how they explained it. Because again, it seems more effective.
So sorry to just go over that again. You were saying because just in case I misheard it, the people who had the adjustment as well as given the pain science background had better results. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, they had better short-term relief, but it was like a spinal mobilization. It wasn't a
mobilization. Oh, yeah. Right.
Okay. Then if they were explained it, then if the therapist explained it with a biomedical explanation, so like, oh, we're putting the joint back in place, that was worse.
Okay.
It wasn't a huge difference, but point is that just you can explain it, and that way it might be a tiny bit better short term, and it's probably going to be better long term, just because you're not creating fear of movement.
Yeah. So once you're addressing the narrative, I guess, because there is a lot of treatments, like as you said, there is some people who come in and they need that short term relief. They need something to just get them by. So I can understand it in that situation, but it's the narrative that makes a difference. And I heard you mention that fragility narrative. What would be some examples of a fragility narrative?
Someone who, well, like if we're going with the adjustment, like someone who's like, oh, my C7 is out of place. Like my osteo or my chiro, my physio puts it back in place like every month. I'm always like, okay,
yeah,
like you probably just do some form of exercise on your own and feel better too. Like I'm not banging on short-term relief. It's very important. I think it's a big part of her job. I just think it's overemphasized. And again, we see an example there where just from a financial point of view, it's like hindering the patient, because it's like, okay, like he's getting his adjustment, feeling better, but that's still like every month he has to pay like $90
to get every 6 weeks.
And sometimes it's like, but sometimes mostly chiros, they have like more regular appointment for life. I think that can be really debilitating financially, which I don't know. What are some others? Some people with low back pain that like refuse to bend they always bending with their knees instead of their back. There's a couple papers. I don't remember. Was it Lee or Arrington? I don't remember who did that paper, but they compared the biomechanics of people who move when they have chronic low back pain, and they compare it to people who don't, and not bending your back ever, like keeping a straight spine, is related to chronic low back pain. So it's like people, the way I explain it might be the wrong explanation. It's just, it resonates with patients, is that like people that have chronic low back pain, it's like they're always moving like they're going to lift a car, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's like a piece of paper on the floor. And that can, like, if you're never doing something, the time you do it might put you at higher risk. Like, I don't know if that's how it works, but just the way I see the body is like, you know, movement is helpful. We see that for osteoarthritis. We like, if you use the joint regularly and not to extremes, it's helpful. It keeps the joint hydrated, reduces the degeneration that's going to happen with time. And if you're never using your spine, well, the one time you do it, you're not ready for it. Like you lack movement preparation. So again, using the short-term acute strategy long-term seems to be problematic long-term, puts you at high risk of chronic pain. There's like a meta-analysis that's going on this. It's like in the works. So the protocol has been dropped, but it's basically, they want to look at movement variability. So right now the data is mixed. So that's why the meta-analysis is going to be really interesting, because so far there's only like a scoping review, which is like a really quick review of the literature. And it shows again that it's mixed, but there's a small tendency for lacking movement variability to be a predictor of chronic pain. So it's like these people have been using the strategy that made them feel good short term, and not using all the other ones, which is problematic because again, they lack movement preparations in different planes or different movements. They never practice bending their spine or never practice bending their knees, and that might put them more at risk of pain.
Yeah.
Right? One way you could explain it is, it's like, let's say you stay in bed, you're in the hospital and you stay in bed for like 2 days. It's going to feel a bit crappy to get up and walk, right? So if you're doing that with your joints to a certain level your whole life, well, your joints might feel crappier. Again, data pending, but it just makes sense so far as a hypothesis, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you're doing in a lot of cases, it's the same as on like kind of a broader view of it. It's the same as like if you're not used to running, or if you haven't run for a good while and then you get out running, you're going to ache after. You're going to be sore after.
Exactly.
I think that's but that idea of keeping your back straight, everything, like, it's funny, even when we were doing, let's say when I was doing the physio degree, we still had a manual lifting, or what do they call it?
I had that too.
Yeah.
Proper manual handling techniques.
Yeah. But that's the one where you bend down, you keep your back straight and pick up the box. Are you talking about that one?
Yes, exactly. Avoid rotation, all that stuff.
Yeah, crazy. It was a massive contradiction, but I suppose you have to do it as well. But it's funny because it's ingrained as well. It's the same, like that is company wide across the board. The education that everyone gets is keep your back straight.
Because we have like systematic reviews on this. Like the Saraceni 2020 was a systematic review, showed that it doesn't predict injuries at work or days missed at work.
Which
we've known that for Saraceni 2020. Yeah, the manual handling techniques that they give out at companies. Yeah,
so if you're fighting that battle, like that's an uphill battle, trying to fight against those guys. And I think as well, it comes back to what we were talking about at the start, and it's actually something that I would like to go back to again, would be in terms of the biggest issues you see on Instagram, like on social media with pages that are posting stuff. A lot of the time it is driving that fear of movement, isn't it? It's like, it's just driving like, okay, avoid this, and keep perfect form in every exercise, keep everything right. What would you explain? And I know you touched on it a small bit at the start. Would you explain why that's dangerous, probably a strong word for it, but why it's not a great narrative to push in terms of the nocebo effect, like what the nocebo effect is, as well as why, like, people who are promoting this fragility mindset, I guess it's dangerous for the general population who don't know that it's not true. Like, what is first off, I'm going around in circles. What's the nocebo effect, and why is it dangerous for people on Instagram to promote?
Yeah. So the nocebo effect is like the pendulum swing of the placebo. So placebo is getting an effect from an inert substance or treatment because of like an expectation, usually is the way it's explained, even though we've had open label placebo procedures where we tell someone, hey, this is a placebo, and it still works. It's just, it's something inert that does something. And then you got the nocebo, which is the opposite, where it's the like something having harm despite theoretically being an inert substance. So you can give like a sugar pill, and if you tell them, hey, this is going to hurt, it can hurt. What's interesting is there's two papers I really like. I think one is by Koyaka from 2018. And what they did is they basically did experimental pain. So the way they do that is they use a heat probe. So they kind of, it's not going to burn your skin, but it's going to hurt, and they can dial the intensity. So they did that to people. They kind of gauged their pain levels. Like, oh, okay, when you push that hard with the heat, it's like let's say like a 4 out of 10 or something. And then they gave 3 people different pills. And they were like, this one is going to help with your pain. This one is going to make your pain worse. And another third group, they were like, this isn't going to do anything for your pain. And they compared the pain levels, and they could see basically that the expectations the patient was given was a correlation as to whether it made the pain worse or better. I'm not sure if that was the Bingle study or the Koyaka. I mixed the two together, but I think Bingle is from 2011. They did that with remfentanil. So it's very useful for research because it's like an opiate that acts really quickly. So like people don't get hooked on it, but it's still pretty strong on pain, if I recall. And the negative group, like the group that was giving positive expectations, like this is going to help for your pain, even though the level of pain that they were giving was the same, like the level of heat. Well, in the placebo group, like it was really effective. In the no expectation group, it was half as effective in the amount of pain relief. And in the nocebo group, they basically had no pain relief from the medication. So it was like, the way I explain it, it's almost like this study saying that having a nocebo effect, so like negative expectations, is as powerful as a strong opiate. Yeah. So it's pretty strong. It can be pretty strong. And then there's another group, again, I'm not sure if that's the Koyaka or the Bingle study. They basically try to use like Pavlov conditioning on patients to kind of make that effect stronger over time. So they use like cue cards to say which level of pain heat they were given. Right. So they would like prime the patients at the beginning and be like, oh, this is like a red card, this is a yellow card, this is a green card, and they would get like different levels of heat. Right. Yeah. And then after that, they retested later. And even though each group got the same level of pain, each 3 groups, basically the color of the card was the one predicting the level of pain they had.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. And it's interesting because like a lot of ways that physio is being reframed is that we're trying to create a positive expectations movement. Yeah. So it's like a catch-all phrase now. So I think that kind of frames this, that like so it's almost like, it's like a long-winded answer, but basically on Instagram, it's, if you're spreading nocebo, it's almost like you're creating a negative expectations and negative experience with movement, which can be harmful. Again, I think it can be really helpful short-term, and I think that's one of the dangers of it. It's kind of like drugs almost, like drugs make you feel good short-term. It's not a help long-term strategy in general. Yeah. I'm talking about like recreational drugs, right? I think it's fine if you do it responsibly, but I don't think shooting up heroin is a good strategy long-term for life.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though it makes you feel great short-term.
Yeah,
I think
pain relief side of it.
Yeah,
it's no, that's it. To be honest, and that's it. That's an excellent explanation. And I wanted you to articulate that I wanted you to talk about it because you articulate it perfectly. I think that the way that you see people really promoting that side of, okay, if you bend down, you're going to do damage to your back. And I know, I actually couldn't name the exact study, but I know that original idea had come from was it done on a pig spine or something? The idea of like,
there's been a lot. It's Stuart McGill, but there's been a lot, but it's mostly in cadaver spines. But there's some other people who did it in human spines as well. I think,
was it McGill?
Not sure. McGill's the big one that promoted it. But yeah, it's really, like a lot of the papers is at least a co-author on them, which is honestly at the level of engineering, it's extremely incredible work. It's just the implications have been taken too far, and the ranges that are used do not translate in humans.
Okay.
So it's basically, usually the way I explain it, again, there's a big review on this pinned on my page, I think. The ranges that are usually compared are something like either just unracking the bar and like not squatting, just putting the bar back on, which is like barely any spine flexion. And then they compare either to another amount of flexion that's like basically like an eighth of a squat.
Okay.
And they're like, C flexion is dangerous. And then they tell you to keep your spine neutral when you do a full squat, which like spinal flexion is inevitable, which we know from McGill's work as well. The unique, like don't remember the exact figure, but it's a deadlift Eddington from 2015, like his PhD thesis. It's like 80% to deadlift and 50% to do a squat. That's like competition standards. It's like you can't avoid it. So the advice is kind of, it's contradictory with McGill's own work. So I like to say that McGill's work is great, but you can use it to debunk his conclusions, because his work is really, really good until you get to the conclusion. And then the other types of study, because there's a bunch of issues. The other big one is they're going to compare it to a ridiculous amount of flexion. So they cut the muscles when they do the studies, and they put them in a rig and use like only one segment. There's not all the stabilizing stuff, first of all. But they go like something, there's a study that went like 400 times, not 400% of the possible physiological flexion. So if you ask a human to bend down and touch his toe, like relax, what we call like a ragdoll position, they did like 400 times that. It's like, who's squatting? It's like, it would be, if you could do that, your head would go through your pelvis.
Yeah.
But alive, you can. They're like, see, flexion is bad.
Yeah.
Right? It's like saying you shouldn't walk with your knees straight because putting like a 400-pound on the leg press machine and bending your knees backwards 180 degrees is bad. It's just like, it's not like, I understand your point. Like this maybe warrants work on really physiological ranges, but that so far it hasn't been done in cadavers, let alone humans. And we've got new works by I forgot, it's like Franken 2022. They compared rowers, and again, that's like one study. It should be better, but basically they looked at people during training. Like rowers, what they do is they do a lot of like loaded flexion explosively. They do a lot and a lot. It's like basically all they do, right? They bend it down almost maximally and then pull down, almost like a Jefferson curl or a deadlift.
A rower, you say, is it?
A rower, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Those were elite rowers, and basically during their seasons, they just got thicker. So it seemed beneficial for the spine, and some of it was like because of structure, if you look at like the fine print. So again, the data we have in humans doesn't seem to translate. And my broad take is that, yeah, bending your spine under heavy loads might be harder to recuperate from, but it doesn't mean that it's bad.
Yeah.
I don't have a strong take. I'm willing to change my take on this. It's just, I hate when people have very, very strong takes, because the nuance kind of kills it. It's like disingenuine.
Yeah.
I think for me, we should be like agnostic and be like, yeah, flexion might be fine. We're willing to change. So I'm not like hard on either part of the debate. I just want people to be honest about the data.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an interesting point on it. I suppose like you don't want to be one side or the other. What I often come back to though, and as you mentioned there about the rowers, is that like the body is it's so well able to adapt that I find it hard to say what's good and bad. And especially when it comes to movement, like what's actually a good or bad movement, what might be good for let's say I don't know, a power lifter who has to get to the bottom of the squat. Like they need to get to the bottom of the squat. They're obviously the knee cartilage is going to build up a lot more. Might not be good for a runner. I think it really comes back down to your the sport that you're in and what you're putting your body under. But at the same time, you can't go away from that idea of adaptation. If you train the body to do something, the one thing it's very good is adapting to do it once you give it enough time to recover.
Exactly.
So I think that idea of like spinal flexion is bad for you. It may be bad to, not even spinal flexion. I should go back and say deadlifts, because this is one I often get, is deadlifts are bad for you. Like if you load up the bar, if you haven't done deadlifts before and you load up the bar and put 100 kilo on it and try pull, like huge chance of injury. But if you've been building it up over time and you've been giving yourself a chance to adapt, very unlikely, unless you're unlucky, and obviously there's times that you are just unlucky, or maybe there's a load has changed and all that, then you're at risk of injury. But often people don't calculate those factors. They don't put them into it at all. They just look specifically at, okay, I got injured doing an RDL or deadlift. All RDLs are bad, or all deadlifts are bad. And I don't know how to. I don't even want to go into it too much more, because the amount of times that I've tried to break that belief in people that deadlifts are bad, and now they wonon't go anywhere near it at all, because they think that it's going to cause bulging discs, it's going to cause damage to your back. They're forgetting the idea of adaptation. It's why we train in the first place. Yeah. So,
I think it's normal. It's kind of like human nature, is that one way I like to explain it, why people harp on form and like specific exercise, is that it's something that's readily visible. Yeah. Whereas variables that seem to have way more bearing on injuries or not, right? So if you see someone get injured, you don't see like the marathon that he ran before. You don't see the load management. Even if we go to adaptation, I think that horse has been beaten too hard. Like it's exaggerated to a point where like, because if you look at elite athletes, they show higher levels of degeneration.
Yeah.
Usually it doesn't have a significant bearing on pain. Like for example, Nikolaevich did a paper on professional soccer players, I think in 2019, and 98.5% of soccer players that have no pain have a meniscal tear. That's like extremely high, but these are like they're performing at the highest. Like soccer might be the hardest thing on your knees on the whole planet, and these guys are performing at a professional level, right? And they have no pain. So again, usually it doesn't have a bearing on pain, but it does use your structures. And the way I like to explain it to patients is that it's like athletes are not striving for health; they're striving for performance, and they're making millions of dollars. So they don't have the same focus as you, but in general, as athletes, we should strive to be more like, if you're going for longevity and health, like staying in like a happy middle is probably a good idea. Mixing strength and like doing a lot of cross training is probably helpful. Because we do see that U shape. We see the same for runners, which is interesting. We see it for injuries and for degeneration for like OA. If you're you're not a professional level, I think it caps at like being like a college runner. Like higher than that, you start seeing more degeneration than casual runners. So like professionals, it's like a U shape. So at the two worst are being either sedentary or professional, and at the bottom you got like a recreational athletes, which do really well in terms of degeneration. I think they have like 50% less chance of getting knee OA and hip OA long term. That's the Alter-Cingeli 2017 meta-analysis. And you also see that for runners. So runners, people don't know that they always shit on like powerlifting and stuff for having high injuries and being dangerous and stuff like that. If you look at running, the injury rates for beginners is extremely high.
Yeah.
It's very, very high. And it's often because like, unlike powerlifting, like often if you try to powerlift, you're just not going to be able to lift the bar if you put too much on it, right? It's like a built-in mechanism of protection. You can still get injured, but it's less likely than running where you can keep going. If you will power through it, you can always do another step. But it's after that, usually your body's going to be like, hey, you shouldn't have done that. And now you have like a tendinopathy. So it's really easy to overtrain running. So I think that's really the big variable, because if you look at more accomplished runners, like people who've been running for a longer time, the rates of injuries go down like significantly. I think it's almost like 9 times lower, the rates of injuries between like trained runners and recreational runners. So again, I think if you look at the literature, it's pretty clear that load management at the biomechanical level is by far the most important variable, but it's always neglected because it's not something that people can view. It's not something you can show in a 1-minute clip on Instagram or an image. Yeah. It's really easy to be like, look, he bent his spine and he broke his back, even though, interestingly enough, we have like a lot of data on like ACLs where we show that it's probably more like the change in the movement is probably formed from the injury itself. Like your ligament pops and then you move differently.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
We've even seen that. Even the one recorded injury from spinal flexion, it's McGill that caught it. It was like a miracle. They got someone deadlifting and you see his disc kind of pop out. And Greg Lehman was saying, if you look at the video, it's not clear whether that person's, and it's honestly, if you look at it, it seems like the disc, like the ligament broke, like the disc popped out. It didn't really pop out, but you know what I mean? Like the ligament broke.
Yeah.
And then the person flexed their spine.
Okay.
Right. Because the ligament wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
It's not like the opposite. So it's like kind of like the chicken or the horse. And usually when we have an objective way of determining the two, there's a tendency for there to be, it's not a clear cut, right? It might be either.
But yeah, that's interesting. And with the going back to that side of things where you were saying with the degeneration, and obviously like professionals, you expect that to have degeneration, but it doesn't mean it's definitely related to pain. In terms of retired professionals, what's your knowledge around retired professionals and that degeneration? Does it lead to pain later on? Or if they continue to keep their exercise levels up or keep running at a certain level, let's kind of stick to runners. That's probably the easiest one. Yeah. Does that have an effect on them down the line?
I'm pretty sure it's probably similar. Like, I don't think we have a specific paper on this, although I'd really want one.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting. I think it's just hard to find a population to do this. There is one paper, like I don't remember which paper it is, but there's a paper that looked at marathon runners, and the number of marathons was pretty high. It was like something like 50 or 80 average marathons per person recruited, and it was like older people too. And their levels of arthritis was like lower in the average population. So my bias, and again, don't quote me on this because we need more data, or maybe I just haven't found it yet, but I think if you're a professional athlete, it kind of probably levels out in the level of musculoskeletal pain compared to a sedentary person.
Yeah.
But it's like you're going to be, first of all, you're going to make way more money, so it's probably worth it. And you're going to be happy because it's probably a passion if you're able to do it at such a high level. So I would say do it. And then my other thing is at the level of like health in general, you're going to be much healthier.
Okay. Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
is also a protector from other injuries, right? Because a lot of like osteoarthritis and degeneration is linked to metabolic factors. If you're a freak athlete and you still train, you're probably very healthy otherwise, right? If you keep a good diet. So it's probably going to be protective as well, at least in the terms of lifespan and stuff like that. So I would say probably go for it. The risks are probably smaller than the reward.
And you were talking there about marathon runners. Did you say they had lower incidence of osteoarthritis or osteoarthritic pain?
Well, yeah, the way that they diagnose it is usually like twofold. It's like the imaging finding and the pain. So it was like symptomatic OA, I'm pretty sure.
Oh yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. Now I don't want to hold you too much longer, because we've covered a lot on that. But one thing, or I suppose I have three more questions for you. So I've one on predatory journals. I have one on a recent bias that you've had to challenge yourself. And then I have one on health. What does it mean to you? So I want to start off with the predatory journals because it's actually not something that I knew about up until a couple of months ago, until those guys put it out. Do you want to speak a small bit on what that is and why it's affecting the profession itself?
Yeah. So a predatory journal is a journal of like low quality that usually won't vet the papers that it gives. It's basically a pay to play journal. So you pay to get into the journal. Whereas usually for journals, the way it works is you either get paid or you don't pay anything. The only reason you would pay is if you want to make the paper free access. But there's some journals like the one that Squat U published in with the Squat Doc and Andrew Locke recently, where it's just like it's really not well recognized, and the owner of the journal has like 6 other predatory journals. So again, the reason we use journals is that it's kind of like a vetting process. You're getting reviewed and corrected, and you're like, hey, this is not okay, this doesn't fit, this doesn't, and they kind of skip that part and make you seem reputable despite the paper maybe being dog shit. So it's problematic because it's easy to spread misinformation that way because you remove the review aspect from peer review. And by the way, there's some great papers that journals that ask you to pay, but it's rare. It's like I don't remember the big one, but there's a really, really big exception. And they ask people to play. I think it's the PLOS, like the PLOS papers. I don't know how you pronounce that, but it's like PLOOS, I think. Whatever, you have to pay those, I think, to get in. But it's a really good journal. But in general, it's like a really big red flags. So yeah, I think that's problematic because again, it allows bad papers to make it through, and you can spread myths that way.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because when I saw it popping up, if you read the paper and if it wasn't highlighted by, I don't know who popped on or jumped on it first, but I can remember seeing that on your page and I remember seeing that on Adam Meakin's page.
Adam, yeah.
If you read that first like that, you'd be convinced. You'd be convinced with the conclusions they were coming to. But yeah, no, it's good to highlight that, and it's good to know that although there is a lot of research out there, and there's obviously good and bad research, there is some research that has been paid to play. Like there has been they just paid enough to get into it. So I guess the next one then it'd be an interesting one because I'd like to get your perspective on it. What is a recent bias that you have had that you've had to challenge or had to change in a way?
That's a good one. I mean, it's not, a lot of papers are like not conclusive. And the things that I'm trying, there's some stuff that I'm trying to change. So I'm not going to mention until it's like conclusive because I know how podcasts work. People are like, oh, I heard on a podcast. They're going to forget that it's a nuanced statement. So big ones I've changed my mind kind of more conclusively on the relevance of like hip strength to knee pain.
Okay.
So there's a huge meta-analysis from Papas from 2015 showed that hips didn't predict hip pain. But this is it was like knee strength. So if you have strong knees, it's going to be less likely you're going to have knee pain. But if you have weaker, stronger hips, it didn't seem to have a huge bearing on pain. This is an interesting line because there's like 3 huge prospective studies, which is really rare in physio, like over 300 people, I think, like runners were looked at for their hip strength and like before they started the season, and then they looked at who was going to get knee pain. And there's one paper that showed that getting stronger hips was a risk factor for knee pain, and another showed that it, if I recall, one said that it didn't, like it, and I think another was like it's like protective. So it's like very mixed at the time, but overall still seems like hip pain doesn't have a huge impact. Hip exercises still help for pain, but we just don't really know why. Holden did a paper on this, and I think it was recently, I think it was like 2020. And she looked at what percentage of improvements in knee pain were due to a gain in hip strength, if I recall. And it was something like 10%. So it's probably mostly neurophysiological effects, which is interesting because a lot of people will shit on manual therapy and be like, oh, look, it's all neurophysiological. It's not even mechanical. We're not putting bones back in place. Well, it's like, well, with exercise, most of the effects are also not biomechanicals, except if we're looking at like injury reduction and stuff like that, where it is very relevant because it's a very mechanical injury.
Nice.
Yeah, so I think that's a big one. I don't remember what the other one would be. Yeah, the relevance of strength for pain reduction. So it kind of falls into the same idea. Like my friend Gerald Powell did a paper on this in 2021. It was like an opinion piece looking at in general the literature, and it's true that there's a big disconnect between how strong someone gets during strength training and how much they get a pain reduction. So it's like the way he describes it is that strength gains from resistance training might more be an epiphenomenon than the cause of the pain reduction. So an epiphenomenon is like something that happens along with it. So a good example would be, after rain, there's this smell that's very I can't say that word, but like very specific to rain. Like it's called petrichor.
Okay. Yeah, I
like
do
the
know.
Smell of wet grass. Okay.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
You could go in the rain and be like, hey, I'm all wet. It's probably because of petrichor. But no, it's not. It's because the water falling on your head, right? So it's kind of like what seems to be the relationship between strength and pain. So it's like your water's not getting wet. Your hair's not getting wet because of petrichor, but petrichor happens when there's rain.
Okay.
You know what that means?
Yeah,
It's kind of like the same thing. So your pain is getting reduced, but it's not necessarily because you got stronger. And again, there are some exceptions, but it seems that overall, especially for chronic pain, there's a big disconnect. But again, it doesn't mean getting stronger is not useful. It's useful for performance, disability, and what's the other thing? Yeah, like reduction of injuries. Being strong is protective.
That's it. Yeah, that's an interesting one because it is. It's one that even as you were saying, like sometimes with just getting people into the gym, let's say who have knee pain, and they can still report like this is more on a 1-to-1. They'll still report that their knee pain is improving, even if they've only been doing upper body stuff. Like, so I guess there's a level of confidence as well that's maybe underlying some of that in terms of like you're working on glute strength or you're working on that, and there's a level of confidence of, okay, now I have a stronger base, and I don't know, is it placebo or nocebo or whatever it is, but it does actually, I can see how that would come into play as well. But that's an interesting one and very specific one to pick out as well, very specific bias, which is good. It's good to see that you're still challenging them all the time. I suppose it's part of the scientific method though, really, isn't it? But I guess the last question I have for you is, what does good health mean to you?
I guess is having, it depends. Are we talking about physical health or general health?
Just general health general health. Health in your own perspective.
I'd say it's having your body being available to you to be doing the stuff that you enjoy as long as you can. So like you can live really long and not be able to do anything of the things that you enjoy. I don't consider that healthy. And then you can be very, very strong and athletic, but that's at the cost of seeing all your friends and loved ones because you're always training at the gym and shooting trend. Like I have nothing against speeds, but like, you know what I mean? It's like you gotta have some balance at some point. So I think that's what a lot of people are like, oh, health is balance. Well, I think there's some truth to that. And again, it doesn't mean like if we go back to the athletes, if you're like, hey, you know what, this makes me really, really happy, and maybe it's not the best thing for me long term, but you're willing to trade it off. It's okay because you're doing what you want, and it's good for you. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'd say it's like being able to do the things that you like, and your body not being in the way for you, more being like a tool that's serving you. And it goes for mental health as well, right? If you're really, really healthy and you can't go outside because of crippling anxiety, it's not your fault, but it might not be healthy as well. So maybe working on that too is a big part of the equation.
But a very, very, very good answer. I have to say it's one of the best answers I've gotten with that question. So to be honest, man, like I really appreciate you jumping on, and I really do appreciate the work that you're putting in on Instagram. I also should say that you did have the opportunity to, at the very start, to floor me because of the name because of the handle on Instagram. You could have went at me, but in fairness, you came at it with a very good approach in terms of you actually had a look through the page, noticed that type of stuff that I was working on, or we were looking at. And I do appreciate that, because a lot of people can just connect to something and not let it go, which is an interesting one.
Yeah, that's weird. I don't get that.
Yeah, no, I get, I've gotten it before. And I then it's like with other physios, and then I have to go explain, and well, actually, no, I do like the biopsychosocial. So you have to kind of explain your way out of it. But no, I do appreciate that. It's a good sign. It's a good sign that you're what's the word? No, not
Equipoise.
Equipoise. That's a nice word.
Equipoise. It's like looking at things evenly, I think.
Evenly, yeah. Perfect. I'm gonna take your
mobility is useful though. Like I was like the biggest hater on mobility for a while, but now I realize the more I train power athletes and especially weightlifters, it really has its place. It's more, maybe the connection with pain sometimes is more murky, except again for very specific populations. And in general, like it makes people feel good. Like I do mobility work. Like
right. That's the thing. I suppose it comes with everything. Is that like the reason that I do it, the reason that I push it a lot of the time, like you're able to address people's fears of movement with different mobility exercise. Like you can put the spine into different positions that they probably wouldn't usually be in. And for me, it's a perfect opening to say, okay, all right, we've tackled the physical side of it, so let's look at all the other emotional side of it and the psychological side of it as well. So everyone has their own way of doing things, but I suppose that's my focus for the time being. But anyway, Alex, thank you so much for jumping on. Where can people find you?
First of all, thanks. It was great being here, and the talk was very productive, I think. I'm No Bullshit Physio on all platforms, especially Instagram, but also I do a lot of like long form videos on YouTube now, which is like my second platform. And then if you're a nerd and you really like research, Twitter is where I get like annihilated by actual PhDs, and we talk about research. It's really interesting. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Nice. Yeah, so thank you guys for all listening again, and make sure to follow Alexia on Instagram. That's No Bullshit Physio, as I said, aptly named. And yeah, that's all good. I will chat to you all again next week. Have a good one.